Good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever you're watching. My name is Professor Gordon Flake. I'm the CEO of the Perth U.S Asia Center at the University of Western Australia. And today is my great honor to serve as a moderator for the public launch, or a public panel rather, launching the most recent Korea Net Assessment for the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, written by the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace Senior Policy Fellow, Senior Fellow for Asia in the Carnegie Asia Program, Professor Jungmin Lee. The report, I think all of you have seen it as you register for this program, is entitled Shoring Up South Korea's National Security Apparatus. We're very fortunate to have not just representation from Washington, D.C. or Korea, but from 3 different continents and 4 different countries. And that gives you a sense for the import of Korea in the world and the research that's been done by Professor Lee. So I'm going to turn the time over to Jungmin first for an initial explanation, introduction of the report. And then once he's finished, I'll come back and introduce our panelists in turn and then bring them into the conversation. So without further ado, let me turn the time over to Jungmin Lee.
Well, thank you so much, Gordon. And let me thank all my friends across the world, and including Jina and Victor and Hideshi. And so, of course, Gordon, you will be giving us a deeper introduction when I'm done. Let me spend just a few minutes going over the latest edition of the Korea Net Assessment, which is a report that I publish at Carnegie every 2 years on key aspects of Korean security. And this year I chose to focus on a subject that people are aware about, but really don't pay that much attention. And that is basically why South Korea, in my opinion, needs a national security bottom-up review. And I think, we have discussed this from time to time, but I believe that time is critical. So before we face a large crisis, either here on the peninsula or in Taiwan, I believe that the time is right, especially as we are witnessing the ongoing brutal war in Ukraine, on how critical it is for governments to pool all their resources together before the dam breaks, as it were. Briefly, what I really try to emphasize in the report is that South Korea, as all of you know, as I've written elsewhere, is a department store of security and defense threats. So if you imagine this one big building that has maybe 2 or 3 basements and then 5, 6 floors, it has an array of traditional, non-traditional, nuclear, biological, chemical, cyber, and of course the list goes on to now include economic and technological security and intelligence. Of course, South Korea is not the only country in Asia that faces these threats. Japan faces enormous threats, as we have seen by North Korean missiles going over Japan. The fact that the furthest Japanese island is only about 100 kilometers away from Taiwan. So Japan feels the heat, as it were, much more than ever before. But if you combine all of that into what South Korea faces, especially under the Kim Jong-un regime, you are also facing a very large China. The other key critical driver in all this is, as you all know, South Korea faces a demographic cliff. And so within the next 20 years, the ROK military, and even now, will face enormous military manpower deficits. And one thing that I really want our audiences in the US and elsewhere to understand is that although defense spending is about 2.57% of GDP, and the Yoon government increased it slightly this year, the overall trend is social welfare spending is growing exponentially. And so if you account for social welfare, health, and education, that accounts for about 11.5% of GDP, and it is growing. So what you see is much slower economic growth, a shrinking population, and a smaller tax base, but growing military and security threats, but also increasing exponential social welfare costs. And so this is a dilemma that many rich countries face, but unlike certain countries in Europe, the fact is we face in South Korea today an array of defense and security threats that are, in my opinion, unparalleled. So why haven't the Korean government done anything about this? So since 1987, as you know, when Korea became a democracy again, each government over a single 5-year term, they've conducted some type of defense reforms. And I would guess the closest they came to some type of a comprehensive review was under President Lee Myung-bak. As you recall, at that time in 2010, a South Korean naval vessel, the Cheonan, was sunk by a North Korean submarine. And in the same year, the North Koreans bombed Yeonpyeong Island. Although there was an effort to talk about broader issues, there really was never a 911 type of commission. And so I'm arguing that it is high time for the Koreans to do this. But why haven't they done this? Well, because presidents do not want to spend political capital on a very divisive issue. And there are deep political divisions, as all of you know, within the left and the right in the Korean political body that makes it extremely difficult for any government to have some type of a bipartisan national security policy. The other driver in all this, I think, is the sort of zero-sum game that governments have faced on optimal approaches to North Korea. And that basically takes up much of the political oxygen for any government. And lastly, I would also argue, and maybe my panelists will agree or disagree, I believe there are deeply vested interests within the national security community, whether it's the defense ministry, the intelligence community, and increasingly economic security ministries that have their own, fiefdoms and own, I guess, blocks, so that this type of horizontal integration, which you really, really need, you really don't see. So let me just conclude by a couple of conclusions that I wrote in the report. And I think it's really, you cannot have a defense policy, an intelligence policy, a national security decision-making process, etc., without putting all this together. And that's a process that requires presidential leadership. And the reason why it's crucial is because we are facing not only a growing North Korean threat, but very large and predominant Chinese military footprints. If you look at the number of intrusions into the Korean air defense identification zone by Russian and Chinese airplanes, it has increased over the last 10 years. The same thing with our Japanese friends. And so, should Korea consider having some type of perhaps a director of national intelligence like the U.S. or Australia, as the case may be? And what type of modalities should we consider in defense technology cooperation, especially with NATO allies? So let me stop there, Gordon, and then I'll leave the rest to my colleagues.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Lee, and congratulations on the launch of this latest Korea Net assessment. I think you did a wonderful job of not only in the paper laying out the fundamental challenges of the environment and the changes in that environment, but a pretty clarion call for Korea to conduct a comprehensive review of its national security system, and then tying that back down to South Korean domestic politics. But obviously, the ramifications of your paper go far beyond just Korean domestic politics. And we're really fortunate to have a regional, a global panel to help us kind of discuss it from three different perspectives. We're delighted to be joined today by Professor Victor Cha. I think he probably needs no introduction to this audience, but he's the Vice President for Asia at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He's also the Korea Chair there, and the D.S. Song Korea Foundation Professor of Politics at Georgetown University. So really fortunate to have Victor share his perspectives from Washington. In turn, immediately after Victor, we're going to be hearing from Professor Jina Kim. Professor Kim is a professor of diplomacy at the Hanguk University of Foreign Studies in South Korea. And then last, but certainly not least, we'll be hearing from Professor Hideshi Tokuchi, who's at the Research Institute for Policy Studies in Tokyo. I think everybody knows Hideshi. He's had a distinguished almost 35-year career in Japan's defense ministry, ending up as Vice Minister of Defense, and so brings a tremendous perspective from Japan. So we're going to go in order with Victor, and then Gina, and then Hideshi. Just initial quick reactions to the assessment that Jung-min has put out, and maybe some perspectives from where you're sitting today. So Victor, we'll start with you.
Well, thanks, Gordon. It's good to see you down there in Perth. You're looking quite healthy. And Professor Kim and Toguchi-san, it's very good to see you both. I want to congratulate my good friend Chung on really an excellent piece of work. These net assessments for South Korea really are very important. They help to shape the discussion in DC, in academia, in the think tank community about how we think about South Korea, South Korean security, South Korean strategy, the alliance. So really, once again, excellent piece of work and something that I'm certainly going to assign to my students at Georgetown. So I guess I'll offer some initial reactions. Gordon, I entirely agree that the external environment for Korea is, as it is for many other countries, is really on fire right now. It's not just the war in Europe and the ripple effects from the war in Europe. As Chung said, China has become much more assertive in terms of its actions and its rhetoric. Raising certainly deep concerns in Washington, in the Washington policy establishment, about a closing window of time with regard to Taiwan. Russia is not only doing terrible things in Ukraine, it's setting an example for North Korea, talking about first use of nuclear weapons. And also, as Chung said, making incursions into Korea's ADIZ. North Korea currently unstoppable program right now in terms of missiles. And then in broadly just the threat right now to the liberal international order against the backdrop of over a decade of democratic rollback broadly, according by most metrics of democracy. So the world is on fire right now, and that's the case for South Korea as well. I mean, I think I want to talk about some of the observations that Chung made later on, but I just want to say at the start that the divides in Korea with regard to conceptions of national security usually have resulted in the lowest common denominator, which is a hedging strategy. Particularly when it comes to U.S. and China. And I just think that's no longer possible. I'm not accusing the Yoon administration of doing that. If anything, I think they are slowly and quietly making choices. Some of them are choices that are rushed by the United States, but I think they are making choices. But overall, Korea, like some other countries in Asia, are trying to find the hedge to get through this difficult period initially. But I think the reality is that this isn't a temporary period. This is kind of the new reality, and that hedging is really not possible anymore. I have some other comments that I want to make about other aspects of security, but let me just start there, Gordon, and then we can carry on the discussion from there.
Thank you very much, Victor. And I will come back to you for those other points. Professor Kim, over to you.
Yes, thank you. I'm very glad to be part of this conversation and congratulate Professor Lee for publishing another excellent policy paper. From South Korea's point of view, comprehensive bottom-up review of the security and defense strategy is timely important. There is no national defense strategy within the defense planning and management system of the ROC, but instead there are basic defense policy, midterm defense plan, and the joint military strategy. So we have such questions as, can these planning documents replace the national defense strategy? Is there any problem caused by the absence of national comprehensive national strategy? Is there any conflict between those separate documents? These questions have been with us for many, many years. So I share key concerns with Professor Lee for several reasons. all these defense planning documents published by the M&D present defense goals. However, there is a lack of specificity to develop means and methods, and the existing documents do not reflect South Korea's security and defense reality, which is continuously changing. The defense objectives set out in these documents are to protect the ROC from external military threats and aggression, to support peaceful unification, to contribute to regional stability and world peace. These goals have not changed since 1994. So the role of the Minister of National Defense is to establish guidelines for developing defense strategies that reflect the president's security strategies every 5 years. It suggests that the contents of the strategy can change every time the government changes. But we certainly need a long-term goal and objectives that can give some directives and guidelines to every related ministries. The M&D is obliged to establish midterm or long-term defense policies by setting national defense goals and assessing available resources, technology requirements for the construction and maintenance of military forces. But there is a question of expertise. M&D's Policy Planning Office is responsible for developing national defense plan by collecting policy suggestions from related departments and divisions or military institutions. Because the document is reviewed by a small number of people within the M&D, there is a high possibility of missing the big picture. And it is, I think, desirable for South Korea to set the vision, goals, and directions for national defense in the future, looking forward to 10 to 20 years. And all these elements should be presented in an integrated way, in my opinion. However, if you look at the existing documents, especially the details of the basic policy, you can soon notice that global security challenges, regional threats, and North Korean threats are described separately without considering how they affect each other. So I think these conversations should continue so that South Korea can have some, grand strategy for the future. I'll stop here for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Professor Toguchi, over to you.
Gordon, thank you very much. First of all, let me thank Carnegie Endowment for having me in this wonderful event. I'm very much honored to be here with these, respective experts. And my special thanks goes to my old friend, Dr. Chanmin Lee. Thank you. And also congratulations on the rollout of the wonderful new report. Actually, it's a fascinating report. Honestly, it's a must read for everyone. So I'd like to, recommend the students in my class to read it through. It's a great food for thought for the Japanese policymakers and planners as well. Dr. Chanmin Lee, you should have published this report much earlier because the government of Japan is about to release its new national security strategy, and the security experts should have read your report before they began to work on their own job. They could have learned a lot from this report, full of deep insight and rich substance. I honestly think so. And Japan and Korea are eternal neighbors, and we are exposed to the same threats as you mentioned. We have to address not only a nuclear-armed North Korea and militarily modernized China, but also impacts of Russian invasion of Ukraine and East Asia. We have to address these traditional security threats with priority, but non-traditional security challenges are not marginal anymore. Dr. Lee's report reminds us that Japan and Korea have much in common. And now, a comprehensive national security review with a whole of government approach and through a thorough assessment of mid to longer term intelligence requirement trend needs is increasingly relevant to all of us. It is because the world we live in is not a universe, but a multiverse. Today's world has at least three faces, even in Northeast Asia: realist one, liberal one, and global one. And in the realist world, we see great power rivalry to fill power vacuums. In the liberal world, the rules-based liberal international order is in flux by the challenges of the authoritarian and hierarchical worldview. I do not think that the concept of the rules-based liberal international order covered all over the world, but that order is not an illusion. Nonetheless, it is seriously challenged by the Chinese hierarchical view of the world and by the blatant violation of the UN Charter by Russia. And also sway of democracy in various countries likely to undermine the value of the rules-based order. And in the global world, transnational challenges such as pandemic and climate change. Your assessment did not mention much about climate change, but it is, I think it is important, and also not marginal in security terms as well. I would argue that protection of natural environment should not be mixed up with national security, and it should be dealt with in the context of environmental policy. But the impacts of climate change on national and international security should be squarely addressed as matters of security. Anyway, challenges are thus diverse. So all instruments of national power should be well mastered, and alliance, cooperation, and partnership with like-minded countries are increasingly important, and seamless combination of these national and international capabilities across domain, across regions, and across the spectrum of conflict, and across the entire government and with partners must be pursued by all of us. I mean, Korea, US, and Japan, and also Australia as well. Whole of government approach is essential, but it is easier said than done. A strong political leadership is necessary, as you mentioned, and this report is the one to set the guiding principles for such an attempt. And needless to say, my final point, the trilateral partnership of these three countries, Japan, US, Korea, must be enhanced and institutionalized, not only in order to address North Korea, but also to stabilize the entire East Asia and the Indo-Pacific. The trilateral partnership should be the core of the alliance network of the Asia-Pacific. And again, Dr. Chamin Lee's report has established the truly guiding principles for this purpose, I think. This is my initial comment. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hideshi. Wonderful panelist comments. And we've now got, thanks to their discipline, about 35 minutes for a conversation. Those of you who are watching this program live or watching it live on YouTube, the wonderful team at the Carnegie Endowment are curating your questions, and they'll pass them on to us as a panel. So feel free to join in. In the meantime, I've got a large number of questions that have come up from these presentations. But I wanted to start by going back to you, Jung-min. The report itself is very process heavy, right? And you use terms like the national security grid, and then you actually block out the grid. So if you haven't read the paper yet, those of you watching it, I very strongly urge you to do it, because in a graphic way, you'll understand the process. And I thought it was quite interesting that in our panelists' comments, we've heard, how the same process is taking place in Japan. Japan launching their national security strategy tomorrow. Obviously, Victor, in the U.S., you've been involved in that numerous times in and outside of government, trying to review these things. Interestingly, and if I just throw a little bit of Australia in here to kind of hand the question off to you, Jung-min. Australia, just like Korea, had an election this year, a change of government. And yet, despite that change of government, in Australia, the situation was very different. On national security issues, there was really no daylight between the ruling party or the Progressive Party, the Labour Party, and the Liberal Party. Whereas in Korea, you do have a very big partisan divide. And yet in the Australian context, despite the fact that there was no daylight, the underlying changes in the environment that you described so well, and that Hideshi described so well, and Jina did as well, have meant that Australia is currently undergoing a defense strategic review. Obviously, Japan has done that. There's ongoing things as well in the United States. So I'm kind of curious, from your perspective, a little bit more about that process. For those who haven't read the report yet, would you talk a little bit more about the process of conducting what you're calling for as a comprehensive review of Korea's national security system? The process side I'm interested in.
Yeah, just briefly, because I don't want to, I want to listen to my friends more than anything else. You're absolutely right. The so-called ABC countries, Australia, Britain, and Canada, in those three countries, Gordon, as you know, regardless of the change in government between progressives and conservatives, the overarching national security strategy remains fairly unchanged. Of course, there are tweaks and, there are differences, but for the most part, those three countries will see basically a fairly consistent longer-term national security, posture. In South Korea, that's not the case at all. Every 5 years, you have an entirely new government comes in. Even between conservative and conservative, and between liberal and liberal governments, there are changes, but not as nearly as much as between left and right. So the first problem is, can South Korea have a bipartisan national security strategy? We should, but we can't because of such deep endemic differences on the best approach to North Korea. The second, as Victor mentioned earlier, I think it's a very crucial point. South Korea has hedged for a number of reasons and will continue to hedge for a number of reasons, but the world is not waiting for Korea to hedge anymore. That's the problem. Now, we could hedge before the pandemic, before Ukraine, before China became so powerful, but that's not the case, whether it's Chip 4, whether it's on intelligence sharing, whether it's on greater cooperation with NATO allies, or even giving, for example, lethal aid to the Ukrainians. These are all issues whereby you've got to really line up. And so what I'm really arguing, Gordon, is that on paper, we have a wonderful national security system, but in practice, it is heavily dominated by the president's office and then the defense ministry, as Jina said. And for those of you who don't know, Jina was she was a top analyst at Qaeda, focusing on North Korea and other issues for over 10 years before she joined academia. And so she's absolutely right. We have numerous defense white papers, defense commission reports, midterm defense plans. But for a country like South Korea that faces such, I would argue, existential national security threats, nothing like the 911 Commission or a bottom-up review has been done. And the reason, Gordon, is you've got to get the intelligence community involved. The NIS is one of several members of the IC, just like the US and Australia. But the Australians, as you know, conducted a thorough intelligence review several years ago, and they opted for the American model. And maybe that is not the right model for Korea, but at least we should go down that route. And so flowcharts are fine. The prime minister's office is involved in a number of nuts and bolts issues, but a comprehensive national security strategy can only happen if President Yoon Suk-yeol decides to put a lot of political capital. Number two, basically align himself much more closely with the international liberal order, as he has said. Number three, he's got to get his own political forces order within South Korea to make this happen. But politically, it's going to be extremely difficult.
Thank you, Jung-min. Victor, in your initial remarks, you pointed very specifically at the longevity of South Korea's hedging posture. 10 years ago, I think hedging was probably more common than not within the region. Most countries, including Australia and Japan, would have been considered to have been hedging. But you seem to suggest that we move beyond that. I kind of welcome your reaction to that, and then the process things that Jung-min raised. And I know you've got a couple of other points you want to make as well. So back to you.
So I think the point that Jung-min just made about how everyone else is moving on or adjusting to the new environment is an important one. I think part of that, in one sense, the Korean hedging, in one sense, part of it is bipartisan, in the sense that you have both conservative and progressive governments that don't want to make difficult choices, and that prefer to sort of try to play in the middle for as long as they can. Basically, hedging is that you're trying to minimize your costs, right? And not so much maximize benefits, but minimize costs. And I think in that sense, I think that aspect of Korean national security strategy is bipartisan. But I want to underline the point that has been made by Chung and then the other panelists about what is unique about Korea's predicament when it comes to devising a national security strategy is that it is deeply divided, right? Deeply, deeply divided, based on just two very different views on how to think about security. I mean, if you think about any country's security in terms of concentric circles, right, the circle closest to Korea is about North Korea, and that's where one side of the political spectrum is traditionally very focused. And then the other side of the spectrum is of course focused on North Korea, but is focused on those other rings, the regional security and the global security rings, much more. And that's just been the way it's been divided. In contrast, if you look across the region, right, Australia, Japan, there isn't, security hasn't been politicized in that sense as much. Where there really is a unity of view. I would argue that even in the United States, while the United States is deeply, deeply divided on many political issues, on the issue of national security and Russia and China, there is no division, right? The new Congress is going to give the Biden administration more money for the defense budget than they're even asking for. Right, and so there is there's one in this group that doesn't look like the others, right? And in that sense, that is Korea. The second point I want to make is, as Jina had said, in the United States, we've just had the unveiling of these major national security documents over the past month and a half: the National Security Strategy, the National Defense Strategy, the Nuclear Posture Review, and the Missile Defense Review. Again, for the most part, there's bipartisanship when it comes to the threats and challenges that the United States faces. And then there's also, really bipartisan consensus on how to think about these threats, in the sense that, Russia and Ukraine, the war in Europe, is seen as the immediate threat. China is seen as the pacing long-term threat, and North Korea and Iran are seen as persistent threats. Now, I don't particularly agree with the last categorization of North Korea, because persistent suggests that it just is remaining the same, but we know that the threat is changing in many different ways. And so, at least in the United States, these national security documents were aimed at shifting the focus of the national defense establishment from almost unitary focus on the war in Europe, shifting it all in the direction of the long-term challenge from China, right? And we're seeing this starting to be implemented very methodically, very systematically, which I think is a good thing. But again, this is much more challenging for Korea, because there is bipartisan support. In a sense, in the new Congress, there's going to be a competition between Republicans and Democrats about who's tougher on China. So that sort of, which has problems in and of itself, but in terms of the question of politically divisive national security strategy, this is a problem in Korea, unlike it is in other places. And I think it's important that Chung-min and his report, point this out. I mean, it's something that we all know, but it's important to be pointed out in a net assessment or bottom-up review of South Korea's national security strategy. The second point I wanted to make is on the new areas that Tokuchi-san mentioned, but in particular on economic security. And choices that Korea has to make on economic security. But let me hold that for now and turn it back to you, Gordon.
Very good. We'll come back to that in a second. Jina, I wonder if you might help the audience understand better the dynamic in Korea. I mean, if you look over the last 10 years, as I indicated earlier, most countries had a hedging strategy and they've moved off to as their views of China have shifted. Views of China and Japan have shifted quite dramatically. And 10 years ago, if you told me that Japan was talking about doubling its defense budget, that would be unthinkable. But obviously, the new reality has led to that. India, which we thought would never move off its kind of a non-aligned movement, has moved in a very similar way. And the presumption from your remarks and for your long time working at Kaida and stuff on North Korea, it seems that the presumption is because of the divided peninsula, because of North Korea, that's why South Korea is still so divided. I'm wondering if you think that's true, and if you think that there isn't a broader shift in terms of, a view of security outside the peninsula that might lead Korea to move off of hedging in a way that other countries in the region have.
Well, first of all, it relates to the current security environment. We all know that North Korea is not really interested in denuclearization, and it talks with either the U.S. and South Korea. So many experts in the defense community are talking about changing of our North Korea strategy. And and another thing is there has been some regrets about South Korea's passive position on Indo-Pacific strategy and participation in the global partnership. So the new government is trying to beef up efforts to contribute more to the global efforts as part of the U.S. alliance system, because we talk about South Korea's passive attitude toward this global agenda. So that's another change in the minds of the South Koreans. And I think South Korea is now ready to bear some costly signaling, because any efforts to signal South Korea's positions in defense of the rule-based order and U.S.-led global global order, that involves some costs, and South Korea is ready to bear that. And certainly, I do believe South Korea has in mind in the past as well that is the way to go, because South Korea so far has worked on defense reform for a future-oriented way, and also South Korea has invested huge amount of money for increasing South Korea's national defense capabilities. That includes also transferring of OPCON from the U.S. And all these efforts has been done for many years. But what we are seeing is more rhetoric about future cooperation and global partnership. So what I see is there has been continuous efforts to increase South Korea's role in the global efforts, but what we are seeing is some visual outcome. Thanks.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that very much. I have to say, from my own experience, I had a chance to see Jungmin twice in November after having been away from Korea for longer than in any period of time in almost 35 years due to the pandemic. And obviously, Korea has changed a lot with the change of government, just because of the ability to articulate and focus on that broader regional or global thing. I might just throw something to you, Jungmin, not necessarily for commenting now, but thinking in the future. We've spent 30 years now talking about Korean unification and benchmarking against Germany. But I think there's something to be said for benchmarking Korea and this issue against India. For the longest time, you had a divided India to Pakistan. India's entire focus in terms of its security and foreign policy was always on Pakistan, both their nuclear policy. Again, they have nuclear issues as well. And where they put their military resources, their defense strategy was always on Pakistan. And yet, over the last 10 years, in the last 5 years in particular, you've seen India, in a similar way to South Korea, has grown so much stronger economically than its neighbor, that it is no longer concerned about that element of competition. And now instead, they're putting their resources into the Navy and their air forces and their concerns about China. So the Quad has to be seen in that light. A whole range of other issues has to be seen in that light. And I don't think that's a comparison that Korea ever makes, because Korea thinks it's unique in having a divided peninsula and having a country right next door. And yet, China, like, obviously, we're not there yet, but India has certainly moved a long way off of hedging. So just kind of a thought that some of you might want to chime in on going forward. You want to give a quick answer to that before we go forward?
Just very quickly, and then I'm sure Hideshi has some thoughts on the India comparison. Prime Minister Modi has so dominated Indian politics for the last 10 years that the opposition Congress party doesn't have a voice at all. And so I think once the BJP dominates the economic, political, and military and security space, there is no doubt where Modi is headed, and that is a greater India. I mean, he aspires to see India as one of the rising superpowers. And so that mindset, I believe, really does call for a shift from this parochial, Pakistan-intensive national security paradigm to a much more regional and global focus. And I think that paradigm is here to stay within the Indian context. And so, although there are similarities, Gordon, between the Pakistani-Indian divide and South and North Korea, I believe that the differences are even much larger. And I think one reason why it is because South Korea has this perennial, black and white view of whether they focus on North Korea or the U.S. alliance, or, for example, on regional issues. But as Jina and Victor has said, the world no longer is that compartmentalized. I'm really sorry about the world, but you cannot say on Monday I'll be focusing on North Korea, on Tuesday I focus on China, on Wednesday patching relations with Tokyo, and Thursday I focus on Ukraine. That's not possible, because we're the world's 10th largest economy, and we are, one of the most robust military powers in the region. And so if South Korea wants a larger voice, you've got to accept greater responsibility in the global commons. And that is it's not hedging, it's rebranding Korea, as it were. And that's where I think Modi has really succeeded for other ulterior motives in the Indian context. But that's what I hope President Yoon will do in the remaining 4.5 years of his term.
Well, thank you. Toguchi-san, obviously Japan has been undergoing its own transition. And we're going to see more tomorrow when the national security strategy is released, but I don't think there'll be many surprises in there, because, obviously Japan also faces, concerns about North Korea and North Korean missiles and nuclear weapons, but it also has a broader neighborhood in rise of China. But Japan has articulated that in a very different way. You want to add a few more things to our conversation on this, please?
Well, I'm not so sure whether I can add, some other things, but Japan is exposed to three kinds of threats: North Korea, China, and Russia. Actually, Russia, the Russian invasion of Ukraine is a reminder that Russia is one of the neighbors of Japan. And actually, Russia is a resident power of this region, Asia Pacific. And I always say that if the NATO countries expend 2% of GDP for their own defense, then Japan should pay at least 5% or even 6% of GDP in order to address three threats. I'm not so sure. I don't think that Japan could, spend 6% of GDP for its own national defense, but definitely the Japanese mindset, security mindset, has changed, particularly because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and its possible impact on the Taiwan issue. As somebody already mentioned, Taiwan is very, very close to Japan. So that geographical proximity and Taiwan's close tie with Japan, these things affected the Japanese mindset. I do not think that Japan will send its troops in order to defend Taiwan, but Japan's own defense and force protection, base protection of the U.S. bases in Japan, these things will be a matter of Japan's own national defense in the coming years. And I think I hope that those kind of things will be reflected in the coming national security strategy.
Thank you. Jungmin, go ahead. You're on mute though.
Yeah, I have a two-finger. Hideshi just mentioned that the Japanese should consider increasing defense budget by 6% of GDP. That's never going to happen, my friend, because Japan doesn't have the money. And so what I really want to say is you go from 1% to 2%, which is also a big shift in the Japanese mindset. We have some questions, and I just wanted to answer this question. A Japanese viewer basically is asking, how will South Korea's rapid decline in birth rates and an aging society impact its importance to the U.S. alliance? And I think the exact same question applies to our Japanese friends. The Japanese and South Korean demographic projection is exactly the same. And so I told one journalist recently, and I'll leave it here, that in 50 years we'll have grandmothers and grandfathers fighting, driving tanks and piloting combat aircraft. I was, of course, joking, but these are critical issues that the Japanese and Koreans must face down the road. In other words, as I said, enormous social welfare spending budgets, and the fact that we have a much lower demographic base. And these are the two of the most important, rich, and successful of American allies in Asia.
The only solace in that is that however challenging Japan and Korea's demographic trends are, China's are much, much worse, and actually precipitously worse compared to what actually people understand. Look, we've only got about 10 minutes left, and there's a number of really good questions coming in. One from somebody who's known to everybody in the panel, Patrick Cronin. Patrick says, I applaud and agree with Chung-Min Lee's call for a comprehensive and bottom-up review. The question is, are Korea, U.S., Japan, Australia in sync regarding how to support advanced commercial tech in defense policy?
Gordon, you take that because you're both an American and an Australian.
Well, I do want to chime in on this because there is a unique kind of Aussie perspective on this. But Victor, that seemed to tie into the last of the points that you wanted to raise. So why don't I go to you first on
that? So I guess I would have a couple of responses. The first is that, and this is, again, reflective of the issues that Chung-Min raises in the report. I think that there currently is budding, maybe more than budding, cooperation of the countries that Patrick mentions among Japan, Australia, and the United States, more so than there is with Korea. Of course, Korea is taking advantage of certain commercial opportunities in the defense industrial space with Australia, with Poland, with others. But I would say among the U.S., Japan, Australia, it's more strategic rather than it is commercial. And so that's another, I think, important observation about going beyond hedging. I mean, Korea is playing a role in some other places, but often that role is determined. It's couched in the language of a sort of broader, Korea playing a broader role, middle power diplomacy, but in many cases it's driven by commercial incentives. And the difference, of course, what we're talking about, the difference is Korea sort of playing a role, as Jina said, costly signaling on issues that go beyond, on commitments that go beyond simply being driven by commercial interests, right? The other aspect of security, which we're all aware of that we haven't talked about as much yet, is this growing emphasis on economic security. I mean, we see it not just in supply chains and reshoring and friendshoring, but particularly in terms of these new export controls that the Biden administration is starting to roll out, none of which can be successful in terms of protection of commanding heights technology without support of countries like Korea, Japan, in the semiconductor case, Korea, Japan, Taiwan, and the Dutch. My understanding is that there are discussions and there's cooperation emerging among Japan, Australia, and the Dutch, but I don't hear about Korea, right? I don't hear about where Korea is in all of this, and Korea is an important player. And where it comes out on these issues of economic security not only matter for Korea, but they matter more broadly for all the other countries' national security interests. So I think Gordon and Chung, you may have seen this chart that I created during the previous administration in South Korea, where we had all these coalitional initiatives taking place among the major democracies in Asia: the U.S., Japan, Australia, the United States, Japan, Australia, and India, right? And if you looked at this sort of, it was like a Venn diagram charting all of these interactions. Korea was sitting there, and it was not connected to any of them. It was extraordinary that Korea was not connected to any of them. Now, I think the current government is trying to change that, but and they deserve credit for that, especially on trilateral with Japan. I mean, talk about costly signaling. The Yoon government really has been signaling a lot about their desires to improve relations. The Biden administration has pushed for, I think the White House said the other day, 22 trilateral meetings since Biden came into office among the U.S., Japan, and Korea across different agencies. So these sorts of things are important. But in the end, there are fundamental choices that Korea has to make that have been highlighted in Chung-min's excellent report that matter not just for Korea, but they matter for the broader effort to support and uphold the liberal international order and the free and open Indo-Pacific.
Gordon, just give me 30 seconds. And, the Inflation Reduction Act is something that the Koreans are very concerned about because Samsung, LG, Hyundai, they've invested billions in factories and foundries in the U.S. And so I think the Yoon government is really, really keen on investing into the U.S. for obvious economic and political reasons. But then the South Korea also then want political, support from the U.S. Congress. You're absolutely right. We've got to do much more. Just quickly, in June, Yoon went to Madrid for the first NATO AP4 summit, which I thought was important. But ultimately, Victor, as you well know, the opposition Democratic Party must come around. They must realize that there is a much greater menu than just focusing on North Korea and China. And until the Democratic Party, in my personal view, really have a more global outlook on these issues, there will be gridlock in South Korea, I'm afraid.
I have to say, I was encouraged. I think last week or week before, Victor, you probably met with him. There was a bipartisan delegation from Korea to Washington. Choi Hyung-do and Kim Han-jung, others focusing specifically on the Inflation Reduction Act. And I was glad to see it bipartisan in that regard. Look, a tiny bit here, because this is really important. I was encouraged, Chung-min, to see in your recommendations, the recommendation that Korea prioritize the focus on economic and technology security. And this is an area where I have a slightly different perspective because I'm looking at it from the region as opposed to the U.S. The Inflation Reduction Act has been a focus on Korea just because of what it excluded, Korean automobile manufacturers. But the reality is there's another element that has caught Aussie attention that implies it affects Korea as well and excludes Japan. And that is, in order to get subsidies, not just for lithium batteries, but other critical materials and future energies, they have to come from countries with which the United States has a free trade agreement. That means Korea's in, Australia's in. Ironically, Japan is not, because the United States pulled out of the TPP. And so it's a real particular challenge for Japan in that front. But the perspective here is that means there's a real opportunity for Korea and other countries in the region to benefit from the size and scale of the U.S. market in advancing these technologies. And the area where this is important, where I think Korea is actually leading, is on that broader question of building secure supply chains on critical materials more broadly, including the lithiums and cobalts of the world, but also on rare earths. And that's a real national security element that the Japanese are probably more focused on than most. The cutoff of rare earth shipments to Japan in 2010, led Japan to fund a Australian mine and company, Mount Weld and Lynas, to do the only commercial scale rare earth processing facility on the planet outside of China, which is in Malaysia. And yet today that remains a major issue. So I mentioned when we were chatting before the call, we were greatly encouraged to have Prime Minister Kishida down in Western Australia just less than 2 months ago, focused very much on future energy. But those supply chains of future battery materials, future communication materials, defense industry materials, all the very specific, both heavy and light rare earths and other critical materials. At this point, that supply chain is almost entirely dominated by China. And Korea actually is ahead of the curve compared to the United States. And together with Japan in recognizing the need to build at least some percentage of an independent supply chain external to China, and their investment shows that. And so I'm glad to see you focusing on that, because I think that's a really important area of future cooperation. It gives you a sense. So I'm going to go to you, Tokuchi-san. We've talked a lot about these issues. Anything else you'd want to add to that part of the conversation?
Oh yes, just one point. The rare earth. Gordon, you just mentioned about the rare earth trade, but today we are facing climate change, and renewable energy production is very, very important. And the materials needed for producing renewable energy, particularly polysilicon. The largest manufacturer of polysilicon is China, and so that should be included in the discussion as well.
Thank you very much. Look, we're almost out of time. Professor Kim, I want to give you the last opportunity as a panelist to make some comments or add anything to the conversation we want, and then the absolute final word will go to the report author, to Jung-min. So over to you, Professor Kim.
Yeah, briefly about the technology cooperation among like-minded countries. Well, it's very critical for South Korea's defense, because in the future planning, full spectrum deterrence should be considered, and it is designed to enable control of many key points in space and time. It is going to be heavily reliant on technology. And South Korea's national strategy should embrace the idea of integrated deterrence, and it emphasizes the integration of lots of things. Especially cyber technology in particular is dominated by the civilian sector, which should be part of military development. And Professor Lee also highlighted the issue of population decline, which is very closely related to the need of technology cooperation, because the decline of the population is leading great urgency to South Korea's efforts to reduce the size of the standing forces. So the military is trying to train more skilled personnel to operate high-tech weapons. And we can see South Korea's efforts to implement its national defense reform and establish cutting-edge forces and etc. So I think more cooperation on defense R&D will be quite needed among the like-minded countries, especially with regard to drones, robots, space-based assets, etc. So that's my thought. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Professor Kim. And again, my particular thanks to three magnificent panelists. We're right at the end of time here. Congratulations to Jung-min for a remarkable paper, and to the Carnegie Endowment for sharing with it. Jung-min, any final words from you?
We are living in this, as Victor said, a world on fire, and the so-called deglobalization world. But Korean security, economic, military, and political and technological, will depend, as always, on a much stronger global Korea. And to make global Korea happen, you've got to do a bottom-up review.
Fantastic.
Thank you so much.
Appreciate it.
Okay.